If you've ever grown up in the ex-territories of Yugoslavia, or hell, even just visited and talked to the people from there, you've probably heard all sorts of stories about the ex-nation and how great and glorious its past was. Stories of great economic prosperity, impeccable military, world-class education, healthcare, and that it was so safe that you could sleep on a bench soundly. Indeed, nostalgia for socialist Yugoslavia and its time is something deeply present in today's generation that grew up in the country.
Sve je bilo bolje, sve nego sad.
According to a poll done by Gallup World Poll, which examined the opinion of people from the 6 republics of Yugoslavia, the overall opinion about the country varied quite a bit from republic to republic. The countries that saw the breakup as overwhelmingly negative were Serbia at 81% of the population, Bosnia at 77%, Montenegro 65%, and Macedonia at 61%. Whilst the population in Slovenia was almost equally split at 41%, seeing it as favorable, and 40% not. The only two from this group that had an overwhelmingly positive view of the dissolution were Croatia at 55%, with only 23% thinking it was a mistake, and Kosovo at 75%, with only 10% seeing it as an error. So, as the past country is held in such high regard by millions of people, the question arises, was it really that good? So let's explore that question and figure out what socialist Yugoslavia was really like. One of the first things many Yugo-nostalgics will mention is the sense of safety and ethnic unity. According to them, overall, it didn't matter what one's nationality nor religion was, as everyone was seen as just as Yugoslavs, and that's it. The nation was a multicultural country whose main ethnic groups in 1991 consisted of 36% Serbs, 20% Croats, 10% Bosniaks, 9% Albanians, 8% Slovenes, with the rest declaring themselves with any other ethnicity, which made up another 20%. As such, the country, according to the memories of many since its foundation in 1945, was able to hold together all of them under one nation and flag, with the overarching idea of brotherhood and unity. The country was also extremely safe, and while this was relatively true, the reality of the political situation in Yugoslavia was a bit more complicated than what's shown on the surface. While Yugoslavia was somewhat stable throughout most of its existence, it was often at the cost of political freedoms of its people. The communists, unlike the Kingdom of Yugoslavia before them, based the Yugoslav identity and the brotherhood and unity itself on a common all-Yugoslav experience of a struggle for freedom and independence during the Second World War against German occupation and fascism. As such, this was a shared ideological value that overarchingly unified its ethnically diverse population. Because of that, the similarities between the Yugoslav peoples were overrepresented, while the more divisive ethnic elements, such as religion and ethnic nationalism, were suppressed, often through repressive measures such as jailing, exile, and murder, most often used to rid of Tito's political opponents and undesirables both in Yugoslavia and abroad, carried out by its state security apparatus, shortened to UDBA in Serbo-Croatian. One of the most gruesome reminders of this suppression is the infamous ex-prison camp Goli Otok. From 1949 until 1956, the camp operated and was tasked with imprisoning political dissidents that opposed Yugoslavia's ideals. It was most prominent during the Soviet-Yugoslav split, and it imprisoned around 13,000 people in the years of operation, mostly focusing on Stalinists and ethnic nationalists. However, many were also jailed there due to disagreements with public officials. At the camp, the prisoners underwent hard labor and torture in the effort to re-educate them. Around 300 people died from torture, being murdered by their fellow inmates, work exhaustion, or simply from disease. The suppression of these ethnic elements was not always successful, however, as there were also several unrests that directly challenged the rule of both Tito and Yugoslav communists, most notably the 1968 student protests, Croatian Spring, and the Kosovo-Albanian protests in 1981 and 1989. All of these were dealt with some good old repression by the Yugoslav authorities, such as direct physical suppression, but also the confiscation of passports and expulsion expulsion from the party. But some demands by the protesters were ironically met years later, as was the case with the 1968 student protests, which aimed for the reform of the socialist system and its better implementation. So, although there was some national cohesion and unity, the Yugoslav political system wasn't without flaws, and definitely showed cracks at times, which of course, the country being a communist dictatorship, did not broadcast publicly and had complete control of the media, with which it could choose to only broadcast the best of the country's image. Also, it is worth mentioning that the Yugoslav political and economic system was gradually decentralized as years went by, with the 1974 constitution being the biggest example of this, which gave almost complete autonomy to the individual republics and autonomous provinces, thus rendering the federal institutions somewhat useless. This, together with the aforementioned sweeping of ethnic tensions under the rug and not directly addressing them, gave way to political and ethnic divisions, which directly contributed to the breakup in 1991. The country's economy is also something that is often praised by many who long for Yugoslavia today. Stories about Yugoslavia's abundance are very common, with many claiming how at that time everyone had well-paying jobs, great living standards, easy to access housing and loans, sufficient funds for extensive vacations, and most importantly overall, job security. And at first glance, it is easy to understand why people from ex-Yugoslavia hold Yugoslavia's economy in very high regard, as socialist Yugoslavia employed a unique system of socialist self-management, small private enterprise opportunities, and backed them by state employment opportunities that defined most of its existence all the way until the breakup, thus giving it the reputation of a different communist state. The system combined state planning with market mechanisms, giving autonomy to workers and to an extent decentralizing decision-making, which at the time was truly revolutionary. However, while this system was somewhat successful during the formative years, generating huge amounts of growth for Yugoslavia until the mid-1960s, it was plagued by mismanagement and rampant unemployment, which were problems that were never really solved and in fact even ignored by the state. In the early 60s, the unemployment in the country was at 7%. By the mid-1970s, it doubled. However, that was just the average. In different republics, the unemployment rate also varied. In Slovenia, the rate was usually at around 5%. However, in more impoverished republics, such as Macedonia and the at the time region of Kosovo, they tended to be over 20%. Party membership and nepotism also played a role, with those with connections being prioritized in getting jobs. However, despite this, it is still impossible to say that the country did not see improvement in its living standard, infrastructure, and public institutions. However, although some of this growth was organic, a lot of it is also due to the state's finances being propped up by foreign funds, similar to how the Rákosi regime in Hungary was able to prop its economy in its days after the 1956 revolution. The Yugoslav state took on several IMF loans to try and prop up its economy, and as a result incurred a large external debt, totaling $18.9 billion in 1981, equating to $65.32 billion in today's standard. In the same year, the GDP was around $70 billion. Progressively, the economic situation kept getting worse due to unsustainable financial practices. In 1965, the inflation rate was at around 34.6%, while at its lowest in 1973, it was still only 20%, which on its own is bad enough. But the perspective becomes worse once you realize that officially hyperinflation is declared when inflation reaches 50%. And since its lowest point, that rate just kept rising, doubling in 1982 and reaching 167% in 1987. As a result, this entire system basically collapsed on itself in the 1980s. Workers, for example, miners, would regularly strike over poor living conditions, and even during the time period of success of the workers' self-management system. The reasoning for this can be boiled down to the system being contrary to the Yugoslav communist rhetoric, created for the purpose of rationalizing and disciplining the workers more effectively. In essence, this system promised economic prosperity to the common worker due to their autonomy in the company, while also giving them room for competition from other Yugoslav and worldwide companies, as it was influenced by capitalism to an extent. However, in practice, the promise of the economic prosperity of the common worker was not delivered for the most part, and the system itself empowered and favored managers, engineers, and white-collar workers over the lower-skilled working class, and as a result, the more educated and higher-skilled workers consolidated their authority over the more abundant lower-skilled ones. The system also, ironically for a communist country, caused inequality due to its commitment to wage differentials so as to secure more skilled labor. This inequality, together with the focus on more stable industrial growth, caused immense unemployment, problems which again were never addressed. And this is where this phenomenon becomes interesting, because inherently, although bringing initial success, the Yugoslav model was inherently flawed. And while in the majority of academia, from economics to political science, these flaws are well noted and used as a case study, the majority of the people who lived in that period still had a positive view of it, even though its short ends eventually came to bite the country in the ass. Now, let's talk about the military. Another point Yugo-nostalgics love to mention is the country's military prowess. The general notion among them is that the Yugoslav People's Army, JNA, was somehow the 5th largest army in the world. While certainly it was a formidable force, during its heyday, the rankings for the Cold War period are sparse. And in the rankings that do exist, from the year 1990 for example, the Yugoslav army was not even in the top 10 armies in the world. However, credit where credit is due, its military was fairly well developed, exceeding the norm for a country of its size. By 1998, the nation possessed 90,000 troops, 630 tanks, 634 armored personnel carriers, and 861 howitzers. Yet, even so, its military prowess was never tested due to its unique status as a non-aligned country during the toughest years of the Cold War. And as such, its doctrine, consisting of total war against the invaders of Yugoslavia, was never applied in real combat except during the breakup of Yugoslavia. Although its military, which was nearly halved during the conflict in the 90s, was still seen by Western military analysts as a foe to be reckoned with, even so, its performance was plagued by a variety of other factors such as the state's economy, ethnic makeup, desertion, and overall morale of its soldiers, as well as its doctrine not being really applicable to a situation as complex as the breakup of Yugoslavia. Even though Yugoslavia at its core was flawed, this doesn't make the positives it had on people any less valid. The people who lived in the time before it was severely deprived, and as much as it was flawed, it was eons ahead of what they had before. Meanwhile, to the generations that came after it, it was also great, as what followed its disappearance was war, death, and political instability. Was the system unsustainable? Sure. But at the same time, it was the best system the region and the people inhabiting it had ever known. And although arguably a better and more efficient system took its place, the countries of ex-Yugoslavia regressed in some political aspects: instability, secessionism, and corruption. Or maybe it only appears that such things today are worse in that regard due to the liberalization of the press. I'll let you decide. Either way, for a time, it was the best state anyone knew in the region, and its marks left on the people were real. So although hindsight is always 20/20, we can see its flaws. At the time, to everyone involved, it was progress, especially considering what was before it. As such, the case of Yugo-nostalgia is very interesting, as ultimately, with all its flaws, it did create real positivity in the lives of millions, and as such, it really can't be dismissed as a completely flawed state, as in the end it still performed better than its neighbors in the east. It could be argued that the nation-building project was short-sighted, inherently unsustainable, and even a ticking time bomb, but ultimately so were the states it bordered, and it did have a positive effect on people, and that perception and those feelings are real. So what do you think? I generally like to know your thoughts about all this. Please let me know in the comments down below. As always, thank you to the members who support my work. If you wish to do so, become a member like them, or head over to theIronicShop.com and get some of my merch. My name is Janos, and you watched Living Ironically in Europe.
Hey, why are you leaving?